In class recently we've been looking at the mammalian kidney, and in particular its role in excretion of wastes. Now, to get a deeper understanding of how the kidney works at the microscopic level in the nephron, we need to have a better understanding of some of the concepts that we looked at in Year 11 in the preliminary year, and this idea of active and passive transport. So we're going to go through a bit of terminology in this presentation and look at how active and passive transport are both needed for the function of mammalian kidney. First thing you see here is a picture of blue dots, and on the left hand side we can see some blue dots and pink dots, and the pink dots are quite bunched together. So they might represent gas molecules of a perfume or a spray, and the blue molecules around it are the air molecules. So if at the time that the molecules are sprayed, they're quite close together. So over time, these molecules will move further away from each other to fill up the space that they're in. They'll be spread out as much as possible. This concept is what we refer to as Brownian motion. So it's called Brownian motion. What Brownian motion is the random movement of particles. So all particles move because of the forces at the atomic level. So they're constantly moving around, and they have an effect on the particles around them. So particles will move randomly due to their interactions with each other and the air particles as well. So Brownian motion. So random movement. And collision of atoms and molecules due to their kinetic energies. So in a practical sense, what Brownian motion explains is this idea of diffusion, where molecules are in a high concentration and they move to spread out evenly across the area that they're in, and we can see this in our second diagram on the left here. Brownian motion explains both diffusion and osmosis, and this is what we call passive transport. Passive transport, because there is no movement of or no requirement of energy. So the first process we look at is this concept of diffusion. So diffusion is the movement of any particle. So movement of particles, molecules from high concentration to low concentration. And it does this until equilibrium is met. So on this graph here we can see there we have the high concentration and we have the low concentration. So from our example before, the perfume is moving along a concentration gradient from where there is plenty or lots of perfume molecules to an area in the rest of the container where there is less concentration of the perfume molecules. Now, once it has reached equilibrium, they still move. They're just not moving in any particular direction. They've filled the container for the amount of molecules that there is. Now we can speed up or slow down this diffusion by heating an environment. That will speed up the molecule movement and that random motion, that Brownian motion. Or we can slow it down by cooling down the container. So the the area that the molecules are in are moving slower. This is what we call a concentration gradient. The second type of passive transport is osmosis. You may recall osmosis from preliminary biology. So osmosis requires is the movement of water, and it requires a semi or selective permeable membrane. Osmosis is defined as the movement of water molecules, from an area of high concentration to an area of low water concentration. And specifically through a selectively permeable membrane. So what we see on this graph again is a concentration gradient. And we can see this movement from a high concentration gradient to an area of low concentration. Okay, we see here our water molecules, high concentration, moving to an area of low water molecule concentration through this blue dashed line, a semi or selective permeable membrane. So when we talk about passive transport, it's referring to no energy requirement. So in summary, we see that diffusion and osmosis are both forms of passive transport. They passively move molecules, and in case of diffusion, it's all molecules. In osmosis, it's specifically water molecules, from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. And we call this a concentration gradient, where the gradient is a slope. So this transport will continue until equilibrium is met, until there are equal amounts of the type of molecule moving on both sides or in both areas. In case of in the body, we see the movement of molecules across a concentration gradient or across a semi-permeable membrane, maybe the cell membrane, until equilibrium is met, until there are equal amounts of salt molecules on either side of the membrane or sugar molecules on either side of the membrane. So before we move on to looking at active transport, we can see that this passive movement of molecules is important, and the fact that it's an advantage that it doesn't need energy. There's no energy requirement. However, the disadvantage is once equilibrium is met, there's no more net movement. So if you require more of the molecules to be in one location, not the other, there's no more net movement. It doesn't move any further. We require active transport in those situations. So the next type of transport we're going to look at is what we call active transport. Active transport. So we can see that in our graph here, we can see the reverse trend occurring. We have a concentration gradient going from low concentration to high concentration. That is, low concentration to high concentration. Okay, so this process specifically refers to, or active transport, refers to the movement of molecules against the concentration gradient. From an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. So an area of low concentration to an area of high concentration. So what we know with active transport is that there is energy required. In this case, energy is required. And it has to move molecules around past equilibrium, past a point of equilibrium. So there is a high concentration in one area and a low concentration in the other, must require energy, because the natural thing it wants to do is to spread out. So these processes are working in the mammalian kidney all the time. So we think of, at a microscopic level, the mammalian kidney has a whole bunch of things called nephrons. And we're going to look at this in a future presentation. These nephrons consist of a really, really small, tiny tube, or a tubule. Okay, so these tubules are also surrounded by blood vessels. So we think of the tubule and surrounded by blood vessels. So these are the blood vessels. And this is the tubule. How this occurs is waste products. So products of waste move from the blood vessels into the tubules to be excreted as urine. Also occurring at the same time, we have products that are needed in the bloodstream, moving from the tubule back in to the bloodstream, so that they're not excreted. So they're substance required by the body. Now this process will only ever occur until equilibrium is met across these two. Once that happens, there is no net movement in one direction or another. So we require something more, because we don't want to retain high levels of urea, nitrogenous waste, in the blood vessels. We want to move as much as possible that into the tubule. Also, we want to reabsorb all glucose, all amino acids, and other products. So without active transport, this can only ever occur until equilibrium is met. Added to this, only excess salt and water is removed from the blood vessels into the tubules, only excess. And that's a very, very important part of osmoregulation. Osmoregulation. So the balancing of salt and water molecules within the blood. And this, of course, is important for this process of homeostasis. So if water and salt molecules need to be conserved in case of dehydration, we need to get rid of more concentrated urine, then it's important that the body can reabsorb stuff that's already in the tubules. So if water and salt have moved by diffusion and osmosis to the tubules, it's important that they can be reabsorbed, so homeostasis can be maintained, blood water salt concentration can be maintained. Salt is moved by active transport back into the blood vessels, and water moves by osmosis passively. We'll finally look at this, the role of active transport, why it's so important in the mammalian kidney. So active transport. Now, it is important that certain substances are not lost from the bloodstream into the tubules. Some of these substances include glucose and amino acids. So glucose, glucose and amino acids. So these things are ultimately very, very important. Don't want to lose them from the body, and they are actively reabsorbed by the kidney. So energy is required. Other products that move by active transport are nitrogenous wastes, and hydrogen ions. And they move from the bloodstream into the tubule. So they go in the opposite direction. Now this is very important. So we can see glucose and amino acids are required in the bloodstream, they're required in the body. So the tubule actively removes them from the tubule. And nitrogenous waste move in the opposite direction. They move from the bloodstream into the tubule, so that they are removed. So remember that these processes can't continue to occur by passive transport. Once equilibrium is met, there is no more net movement. So we require active transport to move the molecules that are needed into the bloodstream and remove the things that need to be get rid of out of the bloodstream into the tubule. In all cases of active transport, we require protein channels or pumps to remove, so protein channels or pumps to move molecules against the concentration gradient. And this requires energy input. Final example we're going to look at is sodium. So sodium is moved by a sodium pump, and it moves the sodium from the nephron or from the tubule into the bloodstream again. So this active reabsorption of sodium also brings about osmosis. So we see this passive movement of water. Now this is really, really important. So this active movement of drawing salt back into the cells brings about the passive movement of water. And it's a really, really important part in the conservation of both water and salt in the body. So the last point we're going to look at today is looking at why diffusion and osmosis are inadequate, what sort of problems they produce. So first of all, we're going to look at problems with diffusion alone. The first thing we can say with diffusion is that it's too slow. The process is too slow. And what we mean by this is that the process of diffusion relies on concentration being higher. So it relies on concentration of nitrogenous wastes to be higher in cells and blood vessels. Once we reach equilibrium, it slows significantly. So the process slows down and can even stop. And equilibrium is met. Okay, so the second problem is that not all waste that can be removed. This is the first one. First one is too slow. Second one, not all wastes can be removed. And we highlight this idea of all. So it is essential that all waste are removed. Essential that all wastes are removed. And if it was only going to rely on diffusion once equilibrium is met, the wastes start to accumulate. So once equilibrium, it leads to accumulation. Now this accumulation, of course, is toxic. So accumulation of nitrogenous wastes and some drugs are toxic. Now the reason they're toxic leads back to what we've been looking at this whole topic so far, that anything that changes homeostasis reduces the effectiveness of the enzymes and decreases metabolism. If you're at decreased metabolic function, it slows down the organism's ability to respond to its environment. Second part we're going to look at is problems with osmosis. Now the problems with osmosis are a little bit different. The first thing we can say, too much water might be lost. Okay, and this occurs because if there's a really concentrated urine, so concentrated urine, more water is into tubules by osmosis. The second bit is more specific to freshwater organisms. So the second part is specific to freshwater organisms, like freshwater fish. And the reason being is because their internal environment is actually got higher solute concentration, so salts and the like, than the water around it. So the problem they have there is, because their tissues are more concentrated, there's a movement of water into their nitrogenous waste, which is mostly ammonia, and it dilutes it. Sorry, movement of and dilutes wastes. So this in turn decreases the diffusion. So it reduces diffusion. So the way around this this inadequacy of diffusion and osmosis is a combination of active transport and osmosis. So the solution is active transport combined with osmosis. Okay, so active transport is quicker and more effective. Uses energy, uses protein channels and sodium pumps to quicken up the speed of which solutes move. So it is quicker and more effective. It removes most waste against the concentration gradient, and that's very important because we need to get rid of more wastes than would allow us by diffusion alone. Concentration gradient. And finally, as previously stated, the use of sodium pumps, so a specific type of active transport, so sodium pumps, so it draws back salt actively into tissue. And then what happens after that is water moves passively by osmosis. So a bit of a mess there, but let's go through this very quickly. So we see there are certain problems with diffusion. It's too slow, and not all waste can be removed. So although we've got them down as 2 points, the process of too slow it comes to being because of equilibrium. Once we reach equilibrium of solutes on both sides of the membrane, so in the tubule and the bloodstream, it slows down and stops. Added to that, not all waste can be removed. So once equilibrium is reached, the nitrogenous waste and drugs start to accumulate, and they are toxic. The problems with osmosis is too much water may be lost. So if there are a lot of solutes to get rid of, a lot of nitrogenous waste to get rid of, more water is drawn from the tissues surrounding it and the bloodstream into the tubule. And this happens by osmosis, which is a passive process. Second thing is particular to freshwater organisms, and we're going to study this in a little bit more depth. But the movement of water into the tubules dilutes the waste, and this reduces diffusion. Finally, the way around all this is to have a combination of active transport with osmosis. So active transport is quicker and more effective. It removes waste against the concentration gradient, and one particular type of this active transport, which is the use of a sodium pump. Now the sodium pump takes salt out of the tubule back into the bloodstream, and that process draws the water back passively, because once there is a higher concentration of solutes in the bloodstream, water will move by osmosis.